Thank you. I feel very big right now, like huge. I could destroy a city. So I want to talk about how specifically responsive design and the fact that it's kind of become commonplace, but there are still a lot of organizations making this transition into responsive design, how that's affected the way that we work together. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that with responsive design, what we're managing is context. We're thinking about providing a different experience, varying the experience that you have based on context. So to put that into context, let me tell you about my youth. When I was young, I spent nearly 7 years of my life, most of my kind of early teens and middle teens, in Saudi Arabia, a little bit south of here. And this was the 80s, this was the 1980s. For some of you, that might mean like big hair and fun music. And for some of you, you probably weren't born yet. And that's okay. The thing that I want you to think about is that in the 1980s, in Saudi Arabia, there was no internet. And it's not because it was Saudi Arabia, it's because there was no internet yet. You know, so the things that we kind of take for granted for finding out about culture, for finding out when you're 8 or 9 years old what's cool, I didn't have, not only because there was no internet, but there was no television. There was no English television in Saudi Arabia in 1982. There was no English publications except maybe a few comic books that I could buy at a military base. And there was no radio except for BBC a few times a day. So if you take all of this stuff away when I was a kid, the only way that I found out about stuff is this. Does anybody know what this is? Yeah, that's a Betamax tape. It's a lot like a VHS tape, which you probably don't know what it is either. But I would get one of these every couple of months from my relatives in the United States. And they would record a couple of hours of Western television for me. So everything I thought was cool as a kid, everything that I was interested in, was a result of a couple of comic books and things I would see on television. Shows like The Smurfs, which was really popular when I was a kid, and Mr. Belvedere, which probably means nothing to many of you. And I would see ads like this on these tapes, commercials like this. Oh, no sound. Is that something we can fix? It's kind of ruined without sound. We tested it. We'll do this really quick. Silly HDMI. Just go to sound. Oh, it's set to headphones. Well, we can make our own sound for this one, and then we'll fix it for the next one. But this was a commercial that I saw, and it just kind of entranced me. I mean, look at what you can do here. You press a button on a controller, it moves a robot, and the robot moves something in the game. And I thought this was like the coolest thing. I want you guys to do this to understand. It might not look cool now, but go ahead and make the Nintendo Power sign. I want you to do it right now. Yeah, he's got it. Nick's got it. Yeah. No, you should do it because it's the end of the day. Yeah, you're going to feel much better by doing that. So when I was a kid, this is what Nintendo meant to me. If you put this into context, the context is I had really limited access to information. I didn't have access to lots of different channels of receiving advertising or anything. And I thought the thing that would make me happy was this NES 8-bit entertainment system. So once I found that, it made me very loyal to Nintendo. It made me a big Nintendo fanboy. And all throughout the 80s and even the 90s when I went to college, I would carry around this Nintendo entertainment system with me, even when there were much better systems. Now I'm in my 40s, and my son is 9. He just turned 9 years old at the beginning of the summer. And he has no idea who this person is. Well, not this person, actually. This is a great person for him to know. That's Dan. But he had no idea who this person was until recently. Now, Nintendo realizes this. Nintendo kind of realizes that these days, the ways in which kids are exposed to content, to advertising, to toys, it's very different than it was in 1980. It's a whole different environment. So what they've done is they've tried to manage that. he has ubiquitous access to information on multiple devices. iPad, iPhone. He's watching TV. He's being told what to watch TV on those devices, and then he can watch those shows on devices. So he has much more flexibility about what he's loyal to. So in order to address that, what Nintendo did was they used responsive design in a way that meets a really specific business need. Now, for those of you that have kids, you know that when you go to a restaurant, you take your kids to a restaurant, one of the things you have to deal with is that they become very bored very quickly, and you want to entertain them. So you might hand them your phone, or they might have their own device that they'll use. So what Nintendo realized is that they could control for that context and create an experience that changes based on touch size. That relates to, it takes you through different kinds of information based on screen size. And it's a website called play.nintendo.com. It's filled with background content and information, but not necessarily to sell games, just to expose kids to these kinds of characters and this universe, to kind of get them acclimated to this stuff in a way that makes sense for whatever size screen they happen to be using. So if they're on a small screen, it's going to focus in only on Mario. And it's going to take you through a lot of detail about who Mario's brother is, and why does Mario care about this princess so much. And why is he a plumber? Because he doesn't do a lot of plumbing. He runs around and jumps on mushrooms all the time. But if you're on a large screen, the world of Nintendo games gets much more complex, and there are lots of different places you can go. So it's kind of uses responsive design to create different experiences, and that smaller screen experience is excellent for keeping kids engaged for a short period of time. Now, everyone in here is a designer. I don't care what your title is, if you're a developer or a business analyst or a project manager or a plumber, you're still a designer. Everybody at their heart is making decisions about making change in the world around them with some kind of intent, and that's what design is. These days, context is probably the most driving factor of design. It's the thing that affects how we design things more than anything. This is Andrew Hinton. Andrew Hinton published a book not too long ago called Understanding Context, and it's a book about thinking about how you put context into your design work. And what he said was basically because we spend all of our time in environments that are digital, Facebook, the intranet that we work on, the websites, Tim's website that shows you, ridiculous websites. We spend so much of our time there that calling those things virtual places is misleading and incorrect. Most of human interaction that takes place right now takes place in digital spaces. So it's really more appropriate to think about this as public infrastructure than it is to think about it as virtual experiences. The responsive design, I think, it's all about helping your users through content across context. So whether you're on a small screen and you're standing, or you're in front of your TV, or you're at home, or you're on the toilet, or whatever, you want to be able to provide access to content and experience in the appropriate way. The promise of responsive design is that it's a single code base and it serves multiple experiences or multiple screen experiences. But what makes it hard is thinking about context, changing context. And the thing that's funny about when we have to make decisions about context, about managing context, it changes how we work with our company, how we work with our team and our partners, because we have to talk to a lot more people. We have to talk to a lot of people about things they may or may not understand at all. We have to talk to our business team about explaining why something is appropriate for mobile, or we have to talk to our folks that are handling product about why we have to deal with responsive images, and what that means for our image production process. And they're not going to understand that. So I spent some time talking to people at larger organizations like Viacom and MTV Networks, and organizations like Marriott. And I asked them, how have they handled organizationally the transition to responsive design? Now, do we get the sound working? Because if we didn't, this is going to be a waste of time. So let's try this. This is Ryan. I'm going to give Ryan a call on Skype, unless sound doesn't work, and then we'll see how that goes. But Ryan was the vice president of user experience and design for MTV Networks. That's a number of channels under the Viacom banner. Ryan, can I talk to you for a second? No sound. So what can we do about that? Yeah? All right, Ryan, can I talk to you for a second? No, he's still not ready to talk to us. Do it again. Nope. Well, I don't want to waste too much time on this. Do you want me to pull up the sound settings? Here, I can get it for you. Yeah, set to headphones. No. All right, well, I'm just going to tell you what happened at MTV. So at MTV, what they used to do is they had product managers. They would have a product manager that would manage events, websites for different events. They had another project manager for shows. So all the shows that are in place of music videos on MTV now, there was a product manager for that, and product managers for other things. And the product managers would generate the requirements. So they would come up with why a website had to have a certain thing. And that would go to design, right? And design, you can pretend he's saying these things right now. Design would take that and do a mock-up of it. If you've seen some of the workflow talks, you've seen how workflow is changing for us as individual designers, but this is how it changes an organization. And that designer would give it to the developers, and the developers would develop it, push it to production. Production would get around to it eventually, and 2 or 3 months later, they would have something living in the wild. They would be a website. And that product owner at the beginning, he'd be like, oh yeah, I remember talking about that 3 or 4 months ago. We finally got that into production. Now that approach to making things comes from something that has nothing to do with the web. It comes from manufacturing. So if you think about a traditional organization, any company, as the company grows, as it becomes more complex, you have departments that are built around disciplines. So these are the people that know about graphic design, and these are the people that know about development. And by putting them together, they can do the same thing over and over more efficiently. We can apply resources to a process. But manufacturing, this approach to organizing a group of people, is built around one assumption, that we're going to start with these materials and get to the same thing at the end of the process every time. We're going to build the same widget over and over and over. But this is the thing about responsive design. Responsive design at its heart is that we don't want to end up with the same thing. We want to end up with multiple different things that are constantly evolving because our devices are constantly evolving. So what they did at MTV was they actually took a different approach to how they organized their teams. So they took one person from every discipline and would create a really small team, 3 or 4 person team. And that team would be assigned to a product. And they would have a short amount of time to make a difference on that product. And every responsive site that they've shipped since going responsive, and that includes the .com, it includes individual show sites, a number of things, all of those have used this methodology, where they change from this traditional way of organizing into an organic structure, where you have a small cross-disciplinary team kind of managing the process, and then as they need to, they can kind of reach out to individuals for approvals or for ideas or for assistance, So this approach, and if you want to read about it in detail, you can read about it at the Responsive Web Design podcast. There's a whole podcast where Ryan talks about getting this into place at Viacom. But this idea is not something that comes from web design. This is called a dual operating system organization, where you have one structure in place for things like human resources and hiring and reviewing your employees, but you have this other structure in place for doing projects, this organic structure. And this is something that's been happening in business for nearly 20 years, where as businesses grow and as they need to be more flexible to do different things as opposed to doing the same thing over and over, they develop this organic structure that operates in parallel with this other structure. So what does that all mean for us? We're trying to get websites and applications built, and we're trying to do them in ways that are responsive, that manage multiple contexts. Well, one thing that means is that the website isn't what it used to be, right? The website used to be the face of our company. We used to think of it as a single marketing vehicle, and it was among a collection of marketing vehicles. So we had brochures and our advertising campaign and our website. But now, because of responsive design primarily, a website becomes the primary point of experience, the way people connect with your content, your organization, your services you provide, across all different contexts, with very different expectations in each context. If any of you have ever worked on a website for a public company, like a power company or any utilities, the context of expectations varies greatly depending on whether somebody's on mobile or they're actually on a computer. What they want to do, whether they want to pay their bill or report an outage or whatever. For that reason, a good responsive website, these days, that is your organization. That is the face, not just the face, but the hands and the body. It's your entire organization to your customers or to everyone. And we already know that responsive design itself is a lot of work. You have to, the fact that when I watched Nick's talk earlier about workflow, a lot of that workflow has arisen out of the fact that we're designing multiple things at the same time. So it's much easier to design and code than it is to create multiple Photoshop comps or what have you. But because you have to do this, it becomes harder to explain. It becomes harder to present. And that's what Stephen's book is about as well, is how do you build responsive design for clients or for organizations that don't understand it. The reason that I'm interested in this topic, and the reason that I'm writing a book about meetings, about how we use meetings in design, is because I believe that the future of any aspect of design, responsive design, interesting things in web apps, all of that, the potential for making things better, the greatest potential exists in conversations. The meetings that we have in our company. But we spend very little time actually thinking about how we use those meetings in the process. What I want to do is just kind of talk a little bit about how you can use meetings in responsive work to do more work for you. Actually put the meetings to work in the design process. If you don't do that, no matter how great your design work is, if you don't take advantage of what your business knows about your audience, if you're not able to sell your work up through your organization, your best ideas just they're not gonna end up being successful. So there are two things I'm just gonna talk about quickly, and then I think we're going to drink a lot of beer. The first thing is, if you think about that diagram, one-on-one meetings become much more important in a process like this. Having the opportunity to have conversations with people one-on-one and figure out how that affects what you're doing. And the second thing is this idea that if you think about a discussion as something you're structuring around things that are urgent and things that are complex, you can get a lot more value out of those discussions and really put people to work on things that they don't understand, but you can get what you need out of them to make decisions for design. So first I'm going to talk about one-on-ones. Now, I use an approach to interviewing, to having one-on-one meetings or any interview research that I do that's called humble inquiry. Humble inquiry is a methodology developed by Edgar Schein. I'll show you his book in a minute. But in order to understand humble inquiry, I actually want to talk about something else called proud inquiry. And Laura, if you don't mind, I'm going to use you as a test subject to demonstrate what proud inquiry is. So Laura, it gets pretty cold in the UK in the winter, right? Yeah. Does anybody ever go ice skating? No, nobody ever goes ice. Have you ever been ice skating? Once. You've been once? What did you think of it? It was scary. Yeah, it was scary. I think it's scary too. But the reason I wanted to tell you is I had this friend who was on the Olympic team. And my friend Nicole, I actually was just asking about ice skating to tell you about my friend Nicole, who happens to be on the Olympic team. So when we ask questions, because we have something that we want to share, something that we're proud of or eager to share, and we use questions as a way of kind of sneaking us into that conversation, that's proud inquiry. Your pride in something you've done, you're using a question as a mechanism to get that. I think we do that in work far too often. We've built something, we need to sell it, we ask questions in a way that we expect to sell what we've already decided. In order to avoid doing that, it requires humility. It requires adopting a position of humility. And it's a specific kind of humility. It's not basic humility. Basic humility is civilized society. Basic humility is what prevents me from walking up to my friend here. Hi, what's your name? Marcella. I'm going to steal this. Thank you. Oh, and I guess I'm going to take the bag too. Thanks. So that's basic humility is what prevents me from doing that. Instead I would go up and say, hi, how are you? And I would actually express interest in how he's doing. I do genuinely care, but it's just a thing that we say. Now, another kind of humility is optional humility. Optional humility is what we have when we meet celebrities or when we're talking to a boss. I also used to work in a photo developing booth. This is a talk using a lot of old technologies. So I also used to work in a photo developing booth. And one day in Washington, D.C., this man walked up to the booth. And he was like, hey, I'd like to get these rolls of film developed. You may not know who this is, but he's an actor. He used to play James Bond. He used to play Remington Steele before that in the 1980s, if that means anything to you guys. But we were immediately very humble to this person because he was a celebrity, because we knew who he was. We were like, how can we help you, Mr. Bond, get your film developed quickly? Because we want, this is a humility. We took a position of humility, wanting to help him, wanting to impress him. And that's another kind of humility, but that's not the kind of humility that helps you ask better research questions or better design questions. Active humility is the kind of humility that helps. And active humility is characterized by realizing that you have a conscious dependence on the other party answering questions in a completely honest and thorough manner. So it's not about making them happy, it's about putting yourself in a position where your success depends on what they say, and writing your questions in that manner. I'm going to show you some examples from design. So I've worked at agencies. I've worked at agencies. I've worked in-house. This is a thing I've heard. Why did you do such a bad job on this layout? That's not a question that displays humility for the other person. A better one might be, how do you feel about this layout? Actually asking the other party what their feelings are about what they've done, and kind of getting out, well, I really feel like I'm struggling with this layout. That's going to get to a better conversation. Another example, why aren't these wireframes done yet? If you do wireframes, a lot of people don't do wireframes anymore, but why isn't this prototype done yet? As opposed to something like, where are you in your process? The question, where are you in your process, allows you to kind of, them to position themselves and you to learn a lot about what they may and may not know about a process that would work for what they're doing. There are 4 kinds of questions that we can ask. There are 4 just basic categories of questions that I have found really valuable to fall back on when I'm doing research or interviewing stakeholders for a design project. The first are feeling questions. So simply, how does this design make you feel? Or how is this choice in the design, how do you feel about that choice? The second is motivation questions. So why is somebody doing what they're doing? Why did they choose that link? Allow them to fill that in. The third is action questions. So questions that take into account the behavior that they're planning on doing. What did you expect to happen, or what are you here to do? What is this website going to do for you? And the last one is system questions, and that takes into account all the interactions around the feelings and motivations and choices that they make. So, what happened when you clicked there? Or how did people react to the choices that you made in that design? Now, when you include an answer to one of those questions, in any of those, that's proud inquiry. And I think that's, in most design teams that I've worked with or consulted with, that's one of the most common mistakes. This idea that, you're saying, well, did you do that to prevent scope creep? To prevent from the client getting angry. You're making assumptions about other people's motivations for why they're doing what they're doing. So I want to tell you a little bit about a specific example of how I use this in a project and how it directly related to responsive design. Because I've been talking about kind of how we ask questions and hacking your own way of asking questions, but it actually has a huge effect on design decisions. So MTV is one of my clients. I've done some work for them this year. And one of the things we focused on for MTV were the websites they use to support events. They do a number of big events. They have the Video Music Awards, and they have European Video Music Awards. They have 3 or 4 other award shows, but every other channel, VH1, Logo, and CMT, they all have their own events associated with them. And the interesting thing about events in the digital space is that events and sports are the only 2 times that people watch live television anymore. Think about when you watch live television. Is there anybody who still makes it a point of seeing a particular scripted show at the exact time it's broadcast? These days, the vast majority of people watch on-demand television, either through Netflix or Hulu or through a pay-on-demand service. But live events, like award shows and sports, still have tremendous power to draw audience. So we were building a framework, a responsive framework to support all of these events. And one of the things I learned from asking really good questions was that there's a spectrum of behavior with regards to these events. On one end of the spectrum, there are people who lean in. People who lean in during live events have multiple devices open, usually larger screens, and they're involved in making those animated GIFs. They're involved in stimulating conversations on Twitter. They want to see behind-the-scenes video of people in their dressing rooms. They just want far too much. They want to see everything that's going on with the event. And then there are people like me, which are people who lean back, People who might watch the first 30 minutes of a show because they want to see the big number, the big opening performance, and they want to see who wins a few awards, and then they'll follow along on Twitter, and they might respond. But the interesting thing about these behaviors is that people who lean in use larger screens, and people who lean back use smaller screens. So this is perfect for responsive design. Responsive design allows us to change the priority of what people see in different contexts. So for smaller screens, it's more about breaking news. It's more about what just happened. But for larger screens, it's more about real-time video. And to get at that, we ask them these kinds of questions. What kinds of actions do people take before, during, and after an event? Just talking to their research team and people who actually watch these events. What else are people doing while they're watching these events? Because they're actually doing this in real time, so what are other things that they might be doing at the same time? And this approach, this allowed us to get to some really good responsive principles that we wouldn't have gotten to otherwise. Now, when I do this, I use a tool like BoardThing. BoardThing is a really great tool that you can use to kind of collect insights and just put them all up on a board. You can have up to 20 people doing this at once together. It's in a private beta, but if you sign up and you mention this conference, they'll let you try it out if you'd like to. But the thing I wanted to, and this is the book, if you're interested in learning more about doing better design interviews. Humble Inquiry is the name of the book. But that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, this idea that as a result of responsive design, one-on-one meetings have taken a different character. They allow you to kind of survey what are all the contexts that we need to serve. And then number 2, better questions, that's a design choice that you're making. Asking better questions is something that you want to just be able to intuit, to kind of feel your way to, well, I know how to have a conversation. But being deliberate with your questions actually allows you to get to better design direction. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is the idea of urgency and complexity. We have a lot of meetings, right? In any organization. This morning, Eric was talking about it at MailChimp, how he used to say when they were 30 people, we didn't have any meetings, and he loved that. But now that they're 400, they have tons of meetings, and he loves that too. There's a way you can hack a meeting to make it more purposeful, to make it work better for you. And if this is something that you feel like your organization might be struggling with, I want to show you a technique that I use. Now, I do a lot of consulting for agencies. And one time I was working with an agency, and their director of project management said something to me that was one of the most terrible things I've ever heard. She said, people love our kickoff meetings because they're short and no one disagrees. And I could not imagine a worse goal for a meeting than spending less time in conflict. Navigating conflict is the job of every designer. Every designer's job is to figure out, amongst all these constraints and all these expectations, what we can and cannot do. Meetings are uncomfortable because they surface conflict. But if we don't surface conflict and manage it in meetings, then what happens? It comes up in design reviews, or it comes up in code changes, or we end up having to do additional sprints, because we didn't surface the right conflict at the beginning of the process. Now, this is how I manage conflict in meetings. When I've done all my one-on-ones, I've collected a series of questions that I think the client wants an answer to, or my team needs answers to, like, how will this fix our business model, or when will this project be done? How is this going to happen? And I rate every question on two variables. Number one, how urgent is this question? How worried are they about this topic? And then number two, how complex is this to explain? For me, as somebody running a meeting, how quickly can I explain whether or not this will fix their business model? That's more complex, but how do we get here? We ran out of money. That's not very complex. We ran out of budget, And then I organize a meeting agenda around doing things that are simple but urgent first. First 5-10 minutes, that's what we talk about. Then for the majority of the meeting, we talk about things that are complex and urgent, and we do it in an entirely interactive way. We don't do any presentations. We just simply do workshops and interactive activities. I'm going to show you an example of one. And then things that are not complex and not urgent, there are great tools for this. Email is great for this. Slack is great for this. Any number of tools that allow you to continue collaborating with your team around things that aren't urgent or complex, don't require real-time working together, synchronous collaboration. I'm working on a website right now for a university called Seton Hill. It's a university outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Any of you who have ever dealt with universities know that universities are democratic to a fault. They allow everybody to have an opinion about what they're building on the web. And as a result, the websites become very overloaded, at least in most of the universities I've worked with. And I've worked on a lot of university sites. So this is their current site, which is a classic example of an overloaded with navigation, overloaded with options homepage. And what we did was, before we met with them, we created a content model. These are all the pieces of content that exist in this part of the experience. And we thought about all the pieces of content that could exist in this kind of experience. And then what we did was we just put them on 3x5 cards. We just made a pile of 3x5 cards, all the different kinds of content that could exist in this design. And then what I did was we got a whole bunch of different departments together at the university. So people who were in administration, people who were in the management of the university, people in finance, people in IT, but also students, faculty from different departments. And we got them in really small cross-disciplinary groups. And we gave each group a pile of these cards. And then we asked them a question. I said to them, if you could pick 5 cards from this pile, only 5 cards, that would be the most important cards for your website, what cards would they be? And I gave them a period of time to kind of discuss and argue about and decide, okay, what are the 5 cards that we're going to go with? And I had them put those cards on the wall. There were 6 different groups of people, and I stopped after everybody had put up 5 cards, and we went around the room. And for one group, we would say, what are the cards you have? And the next group, if they had a card that the previous group didn't have, we'd say, tell us the argument that you had around putting that card on that board. Why is it you guys decided to include that? And we surveyed all the groups to find out, okay, why did certain people decide on certain cards where other groups didn't? Surfacing that conflict and forcing them to make a decision. Then we kind of simulated the idea of responsive, adding a few more cards. Not actually saying this is how your website was going to behave. It wasn't going to add or remove content as the screen got larger, but we wanted them to think in those terms. And anytime we couldn't get to a decision, we couldn't get to a result, if a group just couldn't make a decision, we asked them 2 questions. Number one, who needs this content? And put it in a Post-it note. And what will they do? What will they do with it? So if you saw the social tweet button, that sticky tweet button that Tim had, if we need a Twitter icon on our website, who needs that? Describe the audience that needs all these share buttons. Well, theoretically, Twitter users need that. Well, why do they need it? What are they going to do with it? Well, they're going to follow us on Twitter. So we have a measurable outcome to tie to that design decision as a result of that argument, as a result of that conflict. That's the goal of doing an exercise like this. So you collect all the different variations, and you photograph them, and in some projects, in as quickly as a day, we could take them back, develop a really simple responsive wireframe, that behaves the way that these content types behave. And you could click on different boxes and see what would be in the content. Getting sign-off on something like this reduces the amount of back and forth on the detailed designs that we might do in code or in Photoshop in the future. We ended up doing their new site like this, and we went through one iteration before we had sign-off on it. It was a far more successful approach to getting kind of responsive design built. And we spent much less time kind of going back and forth because we surfaced a lot of conflict in the beginning. And that's the second thing I wanted to talk about. The reason that this worked so well, responsive prototypes helped, but really the savings in time came from the conflict that we kind of put out there, forced them to argue about it before we actually designed or built anything, getting at those decisions. So just to quickly review, because I know we're all eager to kind of get a drink. I think I'm pretty eager to get a drink. Responsive web design is great, and it has been great for some time, because it allows you to serve all these different contexts. But it's kind of terrible because as a result, every new thing that we could do creates more conversations that we have to have in our organization, especially for those of you that either work with or consult with large organizations. The larger an organization, the more hands that you have wanting to have an understanding about what they're doing. In a lot of organizations, they've taken this approach by moving a lot of their design decisions into organic structures that operate in parallel with traditional structures of organizations that kind of happen at the same time. And there's two things that I think are worth noting about this that you can take and experiment with in your own organization. Number one, the idea that one-on-one conversations, that is a much more powerful tool than it was before. With responsive design, one-on-ones allow you to pull a lot of information in and kind of assemble it into a strategy. And number two, using things that people are really worried about and more complex as ways to prioritize what you do in a meeting, that allows you to make meetings work for you. That allows you to spend less time designing finished screens that may or may not be approved. It kind of builds in approval expectation into your stakeholders or into your clients. Now, some of the stuff that I've been talking about, I've been doing for more than 15 years. And some of the stuff I've been doing just this year, some of these techniques. But the one thing I want to say is I don't think this is a recipe. This isn't a recipe for responsive design. This isn't a workflow. This is a series of steps that you could take and hack. I didn't think about trying that in my process. So what I'd love for you to do is, if there's something I said that you feel like it will help you in your work, let me know what you did. Let me know, throw me a line on Twitter or reach out to me at one of my websites and let me know how you've kind of hacked your own process, your own meetings, to get them to work better for you. Conversations that we have are, I think, really underrated tools. They're filled with information that you can use, but if you design the conversation to do more work for you, then you spend less time struggling through getting design approvals. I feel like responsive design, it introduced this level of complexity to web design that did not exist before. The number of contexts and experiences that we're trying to serve literally tripled, if not, went up tenfold. And because there are so many more possibilities, and there's so many more opinions, it makes it a lot easier if you structure your conversations around what you're trying to do for your users, around the context of use. It kind of turns responsive design projects into a type of organizational therapy. If you enjoyed the talk, and I hope you did, I have a book coming out, hopefully early next year, called Meeting Design. It's about people who like to make things, people who design things. How can they make meetings something that they enjoy and that work well for them? And if you want the slides from the talk, they're at that URL. I'll put that up in a second and leave it up so you can write it down. But thank you so much for your valuable time. I know I went a little fast because I know that we want to go have a party. And your brains are probably full from the day. But if you do have questions, I would be happy to hang out and answer them one-on-one because I think that's a more productive way of answering questions. If that's all right with you guys. Does that sound good? Oh, come on. Does that sound good? Do you want to go have a drink? All right, that sounds better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Now, see, I appreciate your enthusiasm for getting to the alcohol quickly, but that doesn't start until like after 6.
You can't.
The tram doesn't leave until 6.
You can't buy.
This is
Switzerland,
Switzerland, Kevin. Well, you probably can. I know for a fact. Anyone been to Cafe? What is it? Cafe Enrique. Everyone know this? No? Anyone? Yeah, they have like this wonderful espresso and absinthe drink. It's beautiful. Yeah, I had that at like 2 p.m. last year. What? It's all right. I wasn't speaking that day. So let's have some, if we have any questions now, we certainly have time for them. There isn't much cleanup or anything like that, any housekeeping for me to do, other than to remind you again that if you have any ideas for any lightning talks, there are a few more now on the board, but they'll be decided on by the staff this evening. So make sure that you put them up there if you haven't already. Any questions for? I mean, Kevin has left us with some really deep stuff to think about how we need to retool our organizations. So I know it might take some time to sink in. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. So that particular meeting was 8 hours. But that being said, I think it's a matter of identifying. Well, no, that portion of the meeting was 90 minutes. So that particular exercise was 90 minutes as part of a larger workshop. But I think it's a function of understanding the expectations that you're setting with your client or your team ahead of time, and then coming back to that at the end. So saying, what do you guys think we're here to do? Are we here to decide on the responsive content hierarchy for this design? Yes. Great. Then we come back to it at the end and say, did we make these decisions? And if we haven't, let's hang out and finish it up before we start designing something. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yep. So definitely, like if everything's leaning on that side, there's a lot of complexity, then that's going to be longer and might break into multiple workshops. I think my experience in client services has been the less in-house capabilities they have. So if they don't have a mature design team or a mature design practice, we're going to spend a lot more time solving basic problems for them. So we're not going to spend as much time in these kind of workshops because they're not technically invested on that in terms of the amount of money they put into their own team. On the other hand, a really mature design team like MTV has a design team of 50 people. So a mature team like that allows us to collaborate in a different way. I don't think there's more or less value either way. I just think it's a different kind of use of meetings.
I have a question while everyone else is thinking about theirs. Do you find any difference in the approach that organizations have to take to kind of update the way that they work, the way they communicate between organizations that have in-house teams that might be more product-focused, they're internally focused rather than, or as opposed to agencies that are externally focused and working on different things? Or are the problems they need to solve the same, essentially?
I feel like the problems they need to solve are the same, but the depth of solution that they can do is very different. From an agency perspective, I feel like an agency can kind of help a client with some basic things and can help them with some market level setting. Like this is what the rest of the world is doing, so we can kind of get you caught up because as an agency, we keep an eye on that and we practice those things.
How about the agency itself? Like have these things applied to an agency?
Oh, internally?
That's what I meant. I didn't phrase it well. So agencies that are doing responsive work and having to update the way that they work with themselves in addition with their clients. Yeah,
so I would say that I have seen that, and with my clients, that's been an issue when I'm building teams. So the way that my company is structured, I don't have any full-time employees. I pull people into projects as I need them. And when I have a sense of what kind of capabilities a client has to build that kind of nuclear team, that core team, that changes the kind of people that I hire. Not just on skills, but also on like temperament and kind of the way that they collaborate. You know, certain developers I hire are great developers to take a task and build it and come back. But other developers are developers that like to talk. So if I know that there's no development capabilities and I'm going to have to shoulder more development effort, then I might hire a more hardcore kind of work in a silo developer. But if I know that this is a collaborative development effort, then I'm going to hire a different kind of developer. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Or start to answer it.
It starts to, yeah. We're going to talk over drinks.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, sir.
Yep. Yep. So this is.
Let me just.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Repeat the question. So you said universities have a lot of content, but I mean, in general, the question is just about content. When in the process do you assess the content?
Yeah, this method, the one that I showed you, is a collaborative way of assessing people's perceived value tied to specific kinds of content. So one step in the process, especially with universities, and I'm not taking a shot at universities because we're in one, but that being said, universities are very reluctant to let go of their content. You know, thousands and thousands of pages of content, and they don't really have any clear strategy behind what jobs those content, specific jobs each piece of content is supposed to do. So this is kind of a good first step at getting them to have that conversation, to understand, oh, you know, we're putting these press releases out, and they have no effect on our incoming student class. Nobody's signing up for, to receive more information about our college because we've put up 8,000 press releases, and starting to get them to think in those terms. But that being said, this is the collaborative part of the equation. There's also an analysis part of the equation where we do, I'll hire somebody to do a content audit and actually assess what's there and what kind of Legos we have to build with. And then that'll inform what we go back and collaborate on. Does that answer your question? Cool.
Any more questions? If not, I know you'll be available to take them, Kevin.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, so